boundaries are really the key to enacting kindness, which is why we're here today, right? Children's Grove has sponsored this. And so we're really talking about how can I use boundaries in all area of my life to be a kinder and more compassionate person, both to myself and to other people.
Happy Wednesday. My name is Sarah Howard, and I'm the Youth and Community Services Manager here at the Daniel Boone Regional Library, and welcome to our Zoom room. A reminder to put questions in the chat, and I just switched a setting that questions will only be seen by the presenter and the runner of Zoom today, so that's me. As always, we are happy to be working with Children's Grove, who's sponsoring this program. Today, our presenter is Emily Arth, who's sharing about Be Kind and Set Boundaries, setting and reinforcing, and the best practices, and many topics included in that. And I know we're all interested in hearing about that. Emily is a local, we can claim her, psychotherapist, hypnotherapist, and certified facilitator of the work of Dr. Brown, and an expert in trauma treatment and a passionate advocate for resilience and authenticity. So we ask that you please turn your attention to Emily, who even did a TikTok for the library about this event. So thank you, Emily. I will magically disappear in the Zoom world and have a great time.
Thank you and welcome everyone. Just some housekeeping before we begin. As she shared already, I cannot see your faces. I can only see what you share with me in the comments. So please feel free to share in the comments. And as we move throughout the presentation, I'm going to have some different prompts for you to share some feedback with me in the comments. So I look forward to that feedback. So here we are at Be Kind, Set Boundaries. And I'm super excited to know that you want to learn about boundaries because, of course, boundaries affect every single area of your life. And pretty much everyone I've ever met is interested in learning about them. So here we are. Just a little bit about myself. Of course, she already introduced me. I am a psychotherapist. I'm also a practice owner. I am local, but I help people across the state of Missouri. And I'm an expert in trauma treatment as well as resilience, which is, of course, our ability to bounce back from difficult life events. I have over 13 years of experience in this area, and I've had the honor and privilege of being trained by some of the world's most respected experts in this field, including Dr. Brené Brown, Marissa Peer, Dr. Kristen Neff, and Dr. Chris Germer. So as we launch into this adventure together, I wanted to ask you first to assess how well right now do you believe you execute boundaries in your life? Just a general sum of your boundary execution, right? One being, I don't even know what boundaries are and I'm here to learn. And 10 being, I'm an expert in boundaries and I execute them with mastery. So go ahead and drop that number in the comments for me, just so that we can get kind of a general understanding of where people feel that they're at in this group. I expect that there will be an array of numbers showing up, which there are. So yay. Thank you. Thank you for that feedback. Continue to give it to me and I will be looking at it more closely when we're done. So to begin, I wanted to share, why are boundaries important? What does the research on boundaries reveal? And so I thought that I would start out by sharing with you just a brief video featuring Dr. Brené Brown, where she's going to talk about some of the findings that she's discovered in her research when it comes to boundaries.
One of the most shocking findings of my work was the idea that the most compassionate people I have interviewed over the last 13 years were also the absolutely most boundaried. Because most boundary. So I'll give you a great definition of the definition of boundary that I use in the book. Boundary is simply what's okay and what's not okay. What I think we do is we don't set boundaries. We let people do things that are not okay or get away with behaviors that are not okay, then we're just resentful and hateful. Me, I'd rather be loving and generous and very straightforward with what's okay and what's not okay. And I did not, that I learned from the research. I was the exact opposite. I assumed for the first 35 years of my life that people were sucking on purpose just to piss me off. That's what I assumed. Yeah, right. Whether it was someone who worked for me or it was family member who was constantly like, I was always critical and judgy. And I was like, why are they choosing these things? Why are they making their choices? They should know better. And then when this thing came up from my therapist, what if people are doing the best they can? I thought my husband had the most beautiful answer to that question. He said, I'll never know whether people are doing the best they can or not. But when I assume people are, it makes my life better. So now I think I am not as sweet as I used to be, but I'm far more loving.
It's not just some like technique so that you can do that. That's really like a way of being to like nurture that soil of wholeheartedness.
Yeah. Generosity, to assume the best about people, is almost an inherently selfish act, because the life you change first is your own. Yeah. And so my question is big, BIG. What boundaries need to be in place for me to stay in my integrity and make the most generous assumptions about you? But generosity can't exist without boundaries. And we are not comfortable setting boundaries because we care more about what people will think, and we don't want to disappoint anyone. We want everyone to like us, and boundaries are not easy. But I think they're the key to self-love, and I think they're the key to treating others with loving kindness. Sustaining. Nothing is sustainable without boundaries. I think compassion and empathy are different things. And again, I'm relying on my data for this. I think compassion is a deeply held belief that we're inextricably connected to each other by something rooted in love and goodness. I call that God. Not everybody calls that God. My dad would call it fishing. Fishing?
Is it fishing?
No, there's no G in fishing. But I think compassion is a deeply held belief. I think empathy is the skill set to bring compassion alive. So empathy is something we can teach. I mean, it's something we've taught our kids since they were very little. It's about how to communicate that deep love for people in a way so that people don't know they're not alone. I think there's a lot of new and interesting information out there about empathy not being a good thing, about that, there's an argument that says, if Travis is in struggle and I practice empathy with you, I'm taking on your darkness, and it leads to burnout, and but empathy is not feeling for somebody. It's feeling with them. It's touching a place in me that knows where you've been. So I can look at you and say, me too, brother. You're not alone in this. And I find empathy to be infinite. I think it gives back tenfold what you put out.
It's sustaining. Like if you've done the work and you have your boundaries, I mean, you could tread that water forever and never get tired.
Okay, so empathy. I'm quoting Travis here, empathy. If you've done your work and set your boundaries, you can tread that water forever. Right. Amen. It's not finite. And it keeps giving back to us. And so this idea that, but here we go back to where we started this conversation. Empathy minus boundaries is not empathy. Compassion minus boundaries is not genuine. Vulnerability without boundaries is not vulnerability. So you see that there's a huge riff here, which is boundaries are freaking important. Yeah. And they're not fake walls. They're not separation. Boundaries are not division. They're respect. Because here's what's okay for me and here's what's not.
All right, awesome. So as Brene just mentioned, boundaries are really the key to enacting kindness, which is why we're here today, right? Children's Grove has sponsored this. And so we're really talking about how can I use boundaries in all area of my life to be a kinder and more compassionate person, both to myself and to other people. And so, boundaries 101, she already brought up that boundaries is just the line between what is okay and not okay for me. And if you're on the end of the spectrum where you really haven't conceptualized boundaries before, just that basic understanding of this line and what exists on either side of it may be a completely new concept for you. And if you're someone who's thought about boundaries a lot more, you may be more acquainted with what goes into the development and the nuance of boundaries. But we're going to talk more about that today. And so, where in my life can I set boundaries? For the sake of this presentation, I'm going to talk about physical, mental, and emotional boundaries. But there are other boundaries, such as spiritual and energetic, that are equally important. But we're not going to get to those today. And so this is just a fun little example of a what not to do when it comes to boundaries.
So, Elaine, you don't have a problem with her, do you?
We adore Elaine.
She wants to say hi. She's with her new boyfriend.
What's he like?
He's nice, bit of a close talker.
A what?
You'll see. I really had no idea that you felt this way about the Costanzas.
They're exhausting. It's like being in an asylum.
This is Erin.
Hello, Aaron.
Hello, Aaron.
So how long are you folks in town?
3 more days and then we're off to Paris.
We're going with the select charter group.
I love France. I was just there last year. In fact, I still have an envelope full of French francs. I'll give them to you.
We can't take money.
Oh, no, it's a gift from us.
Oh, that is so nice, Erin. Isn't he nice? So listen, has Jerry been showing you a good time?
No, I haven't.
I have a friend who works at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. How'd you like a behind-the-scenes tour?
Really? You could do that?
Easily.
It wouldn't be any trouble?
Of course not.
So you get it, right? Physical boundaries are really usually the first boundary that we encounter in life, and probably the boundary that people talk about most commonly. Of course, that example I just shared with you would be an example of just personal space, right? We talk about our personal bubble, how much space I need to feel safe and secure. Remember, boundaries in all areas are about creating safety and security. Boundaries are kind because we want to create safety and security for ourselves and other people. And when we compromise our own safety and security, we're also at the risk of compromising the safety and security of others. So another physical boundary would be like the lines on the road, right? It would be much more dangerous for us to drive on the road if there wasn't an agreed upon boundary about where I should drive. The walls for privacy, right? I'm a psychotherapist, so walls can keep us safe and confidential. Things like locks and keys, or a safe to keep your money, or a bank is a place where you would be keeping yourself safe by having that physical boundary. We also have emotional boundaries, right? Emotional boundaries are something that people tend to think less about. Often with our emotional boundaries, we don't think about them at all until the boundary is crossed, and sometimes it's crossed really far before we even consider it. So a question would be with stress, for example, where is my line between what is okay and not okay when it comes to stress? Am I the type of person who can feel some tension in my neck or my back and realize that perhaps I need to get up and take a walk and go outside, stretch, have a drink of water? Or am I the type of person that I have 3 heart attacks from the stress of my job before I start to think, perhaps I can't really handle this very well? Same thing with anxiety, right? There are certain things in our environment that can cause anxiety for us. Where's the line between what is okay and not okay when it comes to anxiety? And More importantly, when I notice that there's a line between what's okay and not okay, do I know how to communicate that? Because that is perhaps the thing that comes up most often with the people I work with is, well, I knew that I wasn't okay. I felt that I wasn't okay, but I didn't know what to do. So either I didn't actually know the words to say, what I needed to say, or perhaps I knew the words, but I lacked the courage that it took to speak up and to say what needed to be said. Same thing with, like depression. Even if you don't have a diagnosis of depression, do you know your line between what's okay and not okay when it comes to feeling sad or despondent or helpless, hopeless, ashamed, guilty? And do you know where that line is? And at which point you would say, perhaps I need to talk to someone, even if it's a friend or a loved one, or maybe at this point I need to seek some more formal help, like go talk to a doctor or a therapist or something like that. The line with respect. I think everyone has in some capacity encountered disrespect. And have you really thought about what is my line between what is okay and not okay when it comes to disrespect? The area that I see this happen a lot in would be family. I think when it comes to career and work or school or public life, most people tend to have a clearer idea of what their expectations are around boundaries in those environments. But when it comes to family, when it comes to our loved ones and the closest relationships we have, sometimes those boundaries can become blurry, and that can create distress when someone in that type of relationship crosses our boundary. And what do I do? What do I say? How do I handle this? And then finally, even with positive emotions, things like joy and play, there are still boundaries in this area. Perhaps you've worked with someone who didn't have good boundaries around joy and play in the workplace, and maybe they were goofing off when they needed to be working. It wasn't that you didn't appreciate their sense of humor or the fact that they were fun, but it was the fact that they didn't have a clear sense of where to stop that and when to be serious. And then finally, there are, of course, mental boundaries. And these mental boundaries are about where is the line between what I will allow to take space in my mind and what I will not allow to take space up in my mind. So a really simple example for this is like the CNN versus Fox News. You may know someone who they will watch one of those news stations religiously, but don't even think about asking them to look at the other. They have a very rigid boundary mentally around what they're allowing to take up space in their mind. Some other more black and white examples I've put on here, right? Like being a believer or a non-believer, believing in nonviolence or exercising violence. And I would say of all the boundaries, mental boundaries tend to be the ones that we struggle most with this black and white way of thinking. And managing the fear that comes up for us around if we are to open up our minds to allow or entertain new information to come in, what might that mean for us? What might happen if something comes in that could change my mind? And with mental boundaries, I think most people who have fear around opening their minds have an experience of trauma at some point in their life where they were lied to or manipulated in some way. And typically that's where those more rigid boundaries come up mentally, that I don't know if I can trust myself to stay clear and to stay in my own lane if I open my mind up to these other ideas. So in the comments, I'd like you to take a moment to reflect and ask yourself, what are the areas that you can benefit from more clearly defined boundaries? Whether it's physical, mental, emotional, or maybe all of the above, just drop that in the comments for us. And I will again take a look at those as we move on. So I mentioned that the thing that's particularly challenging about boundaries is that we have to get in the gray area. They call on us to embrace this more vague or unclear zone when our brain actually, for survival purposes, feels much more comfortable living in the black and white, which is why many of the people that we encounter in the world tend to see at least some things in a black and white way, because it's creating a sense of safety and ultimately a false sense of control. Our brain likes to think if we can label things, if we can understand what's happening, we have more control in our life. And the truth about control is that the majority of things that we feel we have control over, it's actually an illusion. And to some extent, we need those illusions for survival. So for example, if I think about the actual risk that exists every time I go and drive my vehicle, that would be pretty terrifying, because the truth is the risk of driving a vehicle is much higher than the risk of riding in a plane, for example. So it benefits my brain to live under this illusion that if I'm a good driver, if I follow the rules of the road, if I have my seatbelt on, I'm going to be safe. When the truth is I could be doing all of those things, and it does not remove the vulnerability that exists every time I get on the road, because I'm not in control of all of the events that are happening there. And so it's kind for us to be inclusive, though it does require courage for us to open our hearts and our minds in a way that we can observe things that are different from us while still maintaining a sense of sovereignty and healthy boundaries around our own beliefs, our own convictions, attending to our own emotional needs and our physical safety. And so it says, that this can be difficult. It can be difficult to witness these differences without attempting to change or control them. And so for that purpose, I actually wanted to put in the presentation a little exercise that you can do for yourself that I do with a lot of my clients, that is creating a boundary around control, so that our sense of wanting to control things doesn't start leaking out into other people and other environments where it's really not welcome. And so in this circle is what is in my control, in your control. And then in the square is, of course, what's outside our control. So for example, some things that are in your control would be like how you use your time, how you're using your money and your finances, what your own behaviors are, what your own thoughts are, how you handle your responsibilities. We could go on. I encourage you to go on and think more about this for yourself, to reinforce that boundary and that security in your own bubble of control. Because I think what you'll find if you do this exercise is that there are many things that are in your control. However, examples of things that are outside our control are other people's thoughts and behaviors. For those of us who struggle at all with people-pleasing behaviors, if that's you, 98% of people in our country report some struggle with people-pleasing behaviors. Well, when we are trying to please other people, we can get caught up in what are other people thinking of me, and sometimes the way other people act around us. We can start to personalize that and say, well, what did I do? What's wrong with me? Why would they do that? The weather is something else, of course, is a benign example of something that's outside our control. But emotions are sort of a blind spot that a lot of people don't think about, that your emotions are always outside your control. You can think on some days you might wake up in the morning and be in a bad mood for no reason at all. That would be an example of your emotions being outside of your control. However, when we notice that we're feeling an emotion, it is within our control to look at the thoughts that are contributing to that emotion, right? If I'm thinking people don't like me and I'm feeling sad, well, I can change that thought. And it is also in my control to change my behavior as well. So for example, if I'm choosing to be in a relationship and I notice that it's continually causing distress and anxiety, I could change my behavioral choice in that regard. So this is just an example of how you can support your own boundaries around control. Because what happens when you reach outside your bubble of control and you try to control things that are outside that boundary, it creates more distress for you and for other people. And most of the time, it does not warrant the outcome that we want anyways. And so I would say that the more you can start observing how you use your own control in life, the more you can kind of pull yourself back into your bubble of control and reinforce a real sense of power and control. So again, in the comments, I wanted to ask you then, what do you find most challenging when it comes to executing boundaries? What is most challenging for you when it comes to executing boundaries? I'm just looking back also at the boundaries in your life that need reinforced. It looks like we're getting a lot of people who are saying emotional and mental boundaries. I really don't see any physical boundaries, which does not surprise me. Okay. So I see finding what I can do to change a situation versus just wishing the other person would change. Okay. So yeah, so thinking creatively about like what's even available to me. That's an excellent piece of feedback because in my work, I talk to people a lot about permissions and the permissions we give ourselves in life. And the more that we can bring to our conscious awareness, the more we can start to change. However, 95% of what you do every day is driven by your subconscious mind, which means that even though you're awake, even though you think you're in control, 95% of what you're doing is driven by beliefs and experiences that were recorded at an earlier time in your life. The majority of those things actually took place before you were even 10 years old. And so, yeah, whenever we start looking at what kind of permissions we give ourselves in life, like giving myself permission to feel my emotions and recognize what they're trying to tell me and start to respond to my emotional needs instead of avoiding them or things like that. Well, the problem is permissions, when we're setting new permissions, it's a creative opportunity to do something new because we can't just remove a behavior without replacing it with something else. It's almost like it's a vacuum. It'll just suck right in something else that we already know over and over again. That's why when we tell people, why can't you just stop that? They can't just stop that. They have to replace that. And so if we're struggling with this creative aspect that Heather brought up here, we're not going to see the change that we desire. And so sometimes we do need help coming up with those different creative solutions of how we can replace things. Someone said fear of other people not accepting my boundaries. Yeah, so the fear of being rejected or criticized or judged or even abandoned is a very common fear that people have that can get in the way of setting those boundaries. And that's why working on self-love and the tools and skills that it requires to truly love ourselves from the inside out, that's how we solve that problem of overcoming the fear of what other people think. When we don't want to make decisions in our life because we're afraid of how other people are going to respond to us, we actually have what's called an external locus of control, meaning I am living my life in regard to what other people are thinking of me, instead of living my life from my center, from my core values, being lit up from within and going, I know exactly who I am. I know exactly what I love. And if this is not something that works for me, I have no problem letting that go because I value staying aligned with my authenticity above and beyond basically anything else. Right? Because I know that if I don't protect myself, if I don't protect my own light inside, the quality of what I'm going to be emanating outward toward other people starts to go down and deteriorate. Someone said actually following through. Great. So that's accountability that, yeah, maybe I know the boundary. I know what I wanted to do or say, but I'm not doing it. And in that situation, you know, sometimes we need to look at maybe what are some self-defeating types of beliefs that we're holding that maybe we're not even aware of. Self-worth, you know, that I'm not worthy of following through and actually experiencing what's on the other side. And sometimes just fear, right? The fear that comes up of like change. If I follow through, what's my life going to be? And is it going to be better? Is it going to be worse? And can I handle that? Yeah. So working on resilience and again, all the tools and skills that it takes to know that I can bounce back from any life event is part of the antidote to that. As well as, you know, sometimes we just need an accountability partner. Sometimes it's not that complicated. We just need someone to check in on us, right? And say, hey, you said you were going to set that boundary. Did you do it? Someone said, I struggle to execute physical boundaries with my children, such as snuggles when I really don't want to be touched, but I know that they need it. Yeah, this is often a trauma response, right? Or sometimes people just have different physical needs and physical boundaries. It doesn't have to be related to trauma. But especially when we have other people dependent on us, and in this case, a child, they are depending on us to help them meet their emotional needs. And so in that situation, right, sometimes it's just a matter of setting an expectation or a time limit so that what they want doesn't seem to go on forever, because that can be draining. Like, we can snuggle on the couch for the next 5 minutes, and then I'm going to have to get up and do this or that. Having any type of conversation where it can be construed as shutting someone down. Yeah. So the fear of like looking mean, right? Or looking cold or heartless or like we don't care. I think that what's important for this one is to remember that there is no one in the entire world that everyone agrees with. And so we do need to develop some comfort around being abrasive, that even kindness, even pure joy is actually irritating to some people. I'm sure you've had an experience of being around someone who's in a really low mood. And by the way, your mood, your emotions are an electromagnetic frequency that your body is emitting. It's measurable. We can measure it with a device. And so someone who's in anger, shame, guilt, resentment, you know, depression, all of those negative energies, those are a low vibrational frequency. And so when someone comes in who's at a high vibrational frequency, right? They're just smiling, they're beaming, pure joy, outgoing, laughing. I'm sure you've had the experience of being around the person who's negative, who would say, oh, they're so fake. I can't stand them. It's because that frequency is actually abrasive. It's clashing up against each other, right? It's like two tones of music that do not marry together well. And so knowing that, we have to start to develop some comfort with the fact that we will be, even at our best, abrasive to some people. But are we going to abandon ourselves for the fear of judgment? Or are we going to choose to belong to ourselves first and foremost by setting those boundaries and being willing to be disagreeable sometimes? Yeah, someone said time management is a boundary, turning thoughts into actions or behavior, fear of making others upset. Very good. Thank you so much for sharing those examples. I think that brought a lot of value to everyone. So the consequence, what's the consequence of having no boundaries? Well, of course, lack of safety and security, which we mentioned earlier, feeling like we're exploited or being violated or burnt out, you know, at work. Maybe I don't mind being helpful when I have extra time, but perhaps in being helpful to my coworker, they started to get used to me being able to help them. They started leaning on me in that way. And then when I started having more work, instead of setting that boundary and saying, hey, I'm sorry, I don't have time to help you with that anymore. I had time in the past, but I don't now. we can just keep trying to help that person out. And then we can start feeling like we're being exploited, and that can lead to burnout. Feeling strained or having failed relationships, especially when we silence our needs in relationships, which I think especially a lot of women tend to do. It's like that builds that resentment and those low-lying emotions that maybe in the moment, it's like, oh, it's not that bad, I can handle it. Like, hopefully they won't do it again. And then they do it again. And then they do it again, they do it again until it builds and it builds and it builds. And it can result in arguments and ruptures in relationships and things like that. Of course, we can have deteriorating mental health. Like I said, if it goes to that stress, anxiety, depression, all of those things, our mental health is going to get worse over time. And then ultimately, the thing that none of us want to do is having repeated cycles of mistakes. We all have those things in our life where it's like, oh, like I know better. Why am I not doing better? And actually, those repeated cycles and mistakes can take a huge toll on our self-esteem and our sense of self-worth and self-respect over time, because it deteriorates our ability to trust ourselves. The more we continue cycle after cycle to make the same mistakes without changing our behavior, we stop to trust ourselves. We stop trusting ourselves, which is a much deeper violation even than a lot of other people could inflict on us. So what are the benefits of boundaries? Of course, maintaining that safety and security, feeling confident, capable, and balanced in our life, knowing that, like I said, we can handle what comes our way as it comes our way, enjoying those healthy interpersonal connections, building resilient mental health. The more we practice these skills, the more we become confident in our ability to execute them. But when you see someone who is confident in that ability, remember that's because they've practiced it with courage over and over and over again. And even though they look courageous to you on the outside, they still have nervousness and fear on the inside. And we're learning to grow, change, and adapt over time as we execute boundaries. So as we're setting and reinforcing boundaries, it requires us to have what we call mindful awareness, which is just being present with what is in the moment and responding to it without judgment or criticism. This is important because boundaries have to change. For example, some evenings when I come home and my husband and I are talking, I'm more tired than other evenings. And so my boundary around what I can sustain and how long I can talk and, how much energy I can provide, it's different from day to day. And so I have to be mindfully aware. And instead of telling myself, well, you were able to talk for an hour last night, why can't you talk for an hour tonight? No, I just need to be aware of what I need right now and respond to those needs in the moment. And the same goes for other people, right? We want to be mindfully aware of the feedback that other people are giving us so that we can adjust boundaries appropriately as well, whether that's with children, with our spouse, with our coworkers. If you're a manager, of course, you're having to pay attention to the needs of other people. And then boundaries call on your flexibility and creativity, which we already touched on before. Flexibility and creativity, as well as discernment. Anytime you got a question on a test that said, choose the answer that's the best answer out of all right answers. I have yet to meet someone who has told me that they love a question like that. Everyone I've ever met says, I hate those questions. I can't stand them. The reason why is because those questions call on the highest and most evolved part of the human brain, the frontal cortex. And so when we're exercising creativity, adaptability, and discernment, we're actually engaging our highest part of our mind. And so not only is it challenging because we're building brand new neural connections in the highest part of our brain, but If you have been someone who is currently living in a distressing situation, whether that's work or home life or whatever, or someone who has a history of maybe living for many years in a distressing situation, what happens is your brain becomes bottom heavy, meaning you're living in that reptilian part of your brain that we sometimes call fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. And that's the survival part of the brain. But what a lot of people don't know is that when you're living in the survival part of the brain, the frontal cortex completely turns off and you are not physically able to access that for a period of time. At minimum, you can't access that for 15 minutes. Depending on how strong a trigger is, it could be much longer than that. And so this is also the part of the brain where we do our best learning and comprehending and problem solving. And so if you or someone you know is someone who struggles with that, it is likely because unfortunately you've been living in that more reptilian part of the brain, the survival part of the brain. So shame and boundaries. Shame, I mentioned that your emotions have frequencies, and shame is actually the lowest level frequency that you can vibrate before you're physically dead. Now, like all emotions, none of us live in shame all the time, but some people do have a more frequent experience of shame. And shame goes along with those beliefs that sound like I am not good enough, pretty enough, smart enough, rich enough, you fill in the blank. I'm not enough. Or I am something, fill in the blank, something bad, right? I'm a failure. I am ugly. I am whatever. So we want to know how shame impacts boundaries. And it impacts boundaries by causing a polarity. So that means in some areas of your life, you may have boundaries that are much too loose, almost non-existent. So I put this picture up of just a field, no fence, no sign. For all I know, that's public property, and I can just walk onto it willy-nilly. In other areas of your life, your boundaries may be much too rigid, right? So say you live up here in this tower and there's a moat around this and nobody could even hear you if you screamed. So shame tends to polarize the boundaries. Balanced boundaries look more like a picket fence, right? If you have a picket fence, it's clearly defined what area is mine and what area is yours. So you shouldn't be coming over and painting my house. But if I already have a fence up and my neighbor says, hey, I want to plant a tree on our fence line. Well, now I automatically have questions. What does that mean? Am I going to have branches hanging over on my side? Like what's your expectation? And maybe my neighbor says, oh, I thought we would just cut a hole in your fence and plant the tree right there, and you can just rebuild the fence around the tree. Well, for me personally, I would say, no, thank you. You're going to have to rethink your tree placement because I'm not interested in changing my boundary for that. But that's a great example of what we do when we conceptually have a boundary in our mind, but we do not reinforce it and we give in to what other people want. So say, like a teenage girl who says, I'm not going to, sleep with anyone before I'm in a long-term committed relationship. And then she has her first boyfriend in high school and he's pressuring her and telling her, oh, well, you're just going to have to get comfortable because this is what guys need and every boy needs it and blah, 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 blah. And she gives into that, right? She goes ahead and she restructures her boundary for him. And then 3 weeks later, he breaks up with her and she's devastated because she conceptually had a boundary that she agreed to restructure for someone else. And so when we do that in our life enough times, we eventually look out at our fence line and it's all screwed up and our neighbors got everything they wanted, right? And we feel a lot of things about it. And then we're ultimately going to have to rip up the fence line and just rebuild it if we want it to look right again. So we want to focus on creating this balanced, transparent boundary. So an example of a boundary that might be too loose would be like parents who provide no curfew to their teen when they are first going out, and then they inevitably stay out later than expected. and then it causes the parents to become upset. An example of a more balanced version of this would be to be very clear from the get-go, this is what the curfew is, and this is what's going to happen if the curfew is broken. And then if the curfew is broken, we don't have to get upset about it because we have already communicated the contract, right? There's an understanding here of what's going to happen, and I'm going to follow through with it exactly as I stated it. Because especially with children, and not just with children, humans in general, but especially with children, it is very detrimental for us to renegotiate boundaries. What that teaches a human being is that there is always an exception. And so on top of that, the greatest reinforcer of behavior is inconsistent reinforcement. Meaning if you get a treat every 7 times you do something, that's actually going to reinforce your behavior even stronger. So when you renegotiate a boundary, you have totally sabotaged the entire system here, because what you're doing is you're teaching that person there's an exception. If you talk me into it hard enough, you'll get it. And then, that's obviously going to cause a challenge for everyone down the road. So a boundary then that would be too rigid is, for example, never sharing our feelings with other people because we might fear that we're going to look weak or be taken advantage of, be hurt in some way. And a healthier, more balanced boundary there would be to deepen our connections in trusting relationships by expressing our true feelings and by practicing healthy vulnerability, because that is the only way that we can truly develop a deep connection with someone. So finally, this is all that I had to share with you that I'd prepared for you today. I am opening it up for you to share any specific questions with me now that you may have about structuring or reinforcing your boundaries. So drop that in the chat if you came today with a specific question for me that I may not have covered for you today. What's the best or kindest way to communicate to someone that they have broken a boundary, adult to adult? Well, I think that the best and kindest way, first of all, is if they just broke the boundary, definitely take a beat to get yourself together. Time is an important element of executing kind boundaries. If you feel triggered, take some time. And in that time, as you're calming down, ask yourself, what happened? How did it make me feel? And what did I expect in that situation that I didn't get? Right? And once you get clear on that, you also want to get clear on what it is that you need before you communicate it. So I'll go back to the curfew, right? I'm upset because the teen broke the curfew. They come in, I just want to yell at them about it, whatever. I take a beat. I go, what's happening here? Well, I expected that they were going to come home at a certain time that I didn't communicate. So in that situation, right, I'm the one who actually needs to exercise accountability. And I need to go and tell the teen, listen, it is my fault actually that I expected you to come home at this time because I never communicated that to you. However, I do want to let you know that from this point forward, this is the time that I'd like you to come home, because when you don't come home at that time, it makes me feel anxious. It makes me feel worried, and makes me feel helpless about doing anything because maybe I don't know where you are, or even like maybe you didn't answer your phone. I don't know how to reach you. So that would be a very kind way to communicate the boundary, right? To say, this is what happened. This is how it made me feel. And this is what I need moving forward. And then to ask that person, are you agreeable to that plan? Is that something that you will at least try to give me moving forward, right? And that's also where the boundaries around trust begin as well. Because once that person says, yes, I do understand that, and I do want to do that with you, now their behavior is going to tell you whether or not they're trying to maintain trust with you. right? If they say I want to do that, but make no effort to do it, that's going to deteriorate trust. That's a sign that they're not valuing maintaining trust in the relationship. If they are trying, albeit maybe imperfectly, then we would follow up again, right? We would reassess and we would adjust and we would keep trying. Let's see. What's the best way to set economic boundaries? Can you clarify that, Letitia? Economic, I'm not sure. Are you talking monetary? If you could be a little clearer. This says I can feel the distant annoyance or anger with some of my staff when I start to set boundaries. What's a good way to work through this? It tends to make me not as confident following through. Yeah, I think the first way to work through it would be to absolutely exercise some healthy vulnerability by calling out the emotion, right? So I would say something like, I noticed whenever I set boundaries, there's an air of fill in the blank, right? There's an air of tension, or there are people looking away from me, or I feel like some, I don't know, is it resentment? Is it resistance? So I would kind of open up with curiosity while calling on the emotion and then asking for feedback about that, right? Like, is that true, what I'm sensing here? Because I'm trying to work together with everyone to make life the best it can be for everyone here, knowing that sometimes there are boundaries that I have to execute that honestly, I might not even agree with. I might not even like if I'm a manager, right? I've had managers who have said that to me, like, guys, that don't shoot the messenger. Like, I understand that this is going to make people upset, and yet we need to do it. So that's where I would start with, that is actually working on the emotional response to it, and then asking them what they need, right? Like, it's okay. Like, if there's resistance, if there's annoyance, if there's tension, like, it's okay. I'm bringing it up because I want us to work together on how we can be more productive while attending to people's emotions. So that's where I would go with that. Okay, my own spending. The best way to set economic boundaries. So with spending, I would say, I don't know where you've started, but I would say even just starting with tools for budgeting. If you haven't ever talked to a financial advisor, there are typically free resources out there for you to consult with a financial advisor. That can be a great first place to begin learning, like, how to just vaguely break down a basic budget when it comes to like savings, spending, whatnot. There are apps that are free. There's one called Mint. There's one called YNAB. Some of them have in-app purchases, but there are apps for budgeting that I would encourage you to take a look at. All right. Well, I'm going to stop there with the questions because I don't want to keep people longer than what you have planned to be here. We have about 7 minutes till the hour is up. If you are interested in ever finding me, working with me, consulting with me, you can find my information here at mlifecounseling.com. Otherwise, I think Sarah will come back on to you now. We can't hear you yet, Sarah. Sorry.
Oh, you can't. Sorry about that. Thank you so much, Emily. It's been great having you here. Thanks for the great turnout. We're so thrilled that you were able to spend some time with us today. We will have a recording up on the website probably within a week. So if you know people that weren't able to be here, you can point them to it and share it. So thanks, and go out and have a great afternoon.